have such sights to show you.
We're Poppin the Scary Horror Podcast. I'm your host, I'm your host, Coale, and with me, as always, I have my good friend and co-host, Aaron. Aaron, catching me off guard here, buddy.
Yeah, always. You know how it is.
Yeah, you got to keep me on my tippy toes here. You know, just really helps build the suspense, you know, and you know who's really good at suspense and horror? Stephen King.
True.
Yes.
You know?
So today's episode, we are watching the adaptation of Misery. Now, Aaron, we may have talked about, well, I mean, more than likely, we've definitely talked about Stephen King in the past. What capacity about him in particular? I honestly can't even remember, because I know we talked about him about the Shining and It films.
And I think Carrie,
yeah, and Carrie as well. Hot dog, look at you go! You're on fire.
I remember the episodes we recorded.
Break out the.
Sometimes
I'm glad you two need to break out the fire extinguisher just because you're on fire. So, yeah, and I guess to reiterate the audience, in case they haven't seen previous Stephen King episodes, have you read a lot of Stephen King novels?
No, I've never read a Stephen King novel. No,
Okay.
I'm aware of the ones that are of pop culture significance for the most part, but even though I've heard this title before, I don't know what Misery's about. Yeah.
Okay, well, no worries, and I will keep it very ambiguous in that part, because I want you to be very surprised in everything, but yeah, I mean, would you say overall the adaptations, I mean, obviously it's been done by different directors, and, you know, directors take liberties that are different from the book, infamously with Stanley Kubrick, as I'm sure you've heard about how much he begroaned that adaptation and everything. Have you felt like the stories Stephen King has come up with have been fairly good?
Yeah, I think so. I think they actually adapt to movies pretty good too, or maybe just good directors are picking Stephen King novels to adapt. But even outside of what because I've watched pretty much everything we watched from Stephen King, I think I've liked. That we've watched on the podcast. But even like some of the other adaptations, like Green Mile or Shawshank Redemption, him too. Yeah, like those. I mean, those are also excellent movies that are Stephen King adaptations. So I think I've said before this podcast even that the formula for a good movie is you just adapt a Stephen King book. But it's in all my experience so far, they've all been good.
Okay, well, that's good. So do you think this one is going to break the streak or continue the streak?
Maybe. Yeah, it's pretty easy to make a bad movie, so, especially in the horror genre where the budgets can be low. So I don't know, it could be a bad one, but my hopes are maybe a little higher than average because, Stephen King novel's probably good.
Yeah. So you don't really, again, like you've mentioned before, don't have any context, never heard about Misery or nothing like that and everything.
It's the state that is usually last in everything. Missouri, right?
Yeah, we don't talk about that.
Sorry.
No, you're yeah, so I guess I'll talk about my experience with Misery. Okay. So like I said, I'm terrible at reading books, and I have so many of Stephen King's books being like, oh yeah, if I buy it, that means I'm gonna read it. That ain't the case at all whatsoever. I still have only read one Stephen King book, and that was Cujo, and that was because it was one of the shorter books, and that was like the very first Stephen King book I read, where I'm like, wow, this is great, I'm going to get the others and never read them, apparently.
That's what I do with books.
Yeah. But Misery is definitely an interesting one. I also have not read that novel. I mean, obviously it's made apparent, as I said, I only read Cujo. But whenever it came to the film adaptation, a lot of people have talked about this film and have had a general consensus with the film. I've only ever seen this film once, and this was like years ago, like back whenever Netflix was delivering disc years ago, like a very long time ago.
Days of yore.
Yes, in the grand days of yore. Back in my day, there were no fancy digital Netflix. It was sending disc through the mailbox.
You had to walk uphill 5 miles in the snow to the Family Video, Blockbuster Hollywood Video, and get a rental that may or may not have a wad of gum chewed up in the middle of the VHS.
Yes, exactly that. And so I'm curious to revisit this film, and I am very glad to be talking about it on the podcast because I think this film will probably have a lot of interesting points to talk about and kind of evaluate and kind of overlook, but yeah, I mean, aside from that, I won't give too much away since you're kind of in the dark about everything.
Yeah.
So
in general.
Yes.
But especially this episode.
Okay, well, let's bring you to the light, shall we? Let's just.
I see the light.
Yeah.
I'm gonna go to the light.
Okay, I'll meet you there later.
See y'all on the other side.
Yeah. And we'll see you on the other side whenever we finish watching Misery.
Yay!
I'm your number 1 fan. There is nothing to worry about.
You're gonna be just fine. I'll take good care of you.
I'm your number 1 fan.
And we are back from watching a Misery.
Misery.
Yes, Misery. What'd you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think my old adage holds true. Adapt a Stephen King novel, you got a good movie.
Yeah, in all honesty, I can't fault you there, bud. So definitely glad that it seems like for the most part you enjoyed yourself and enjoyed the film.
Yeah, did you enjoy yourself?
You know, it's funny because I didn't want to bring it up before, but the first time I watched it, people had talked it up so much that I think I had set the bar too high for it and everything. And whenever I watched it initially, and this is like years ago, I remember kind of being like, okay, sort of shrug or whatever, but giving it time and just knowing like, okay, I wasn't a huge fan of it. Like I liked it fine whenever I first saw it or whatever, but giving it time and just kind of coming in from a neutral state, definitely enjoyed it a lot more and everything. There's definitely a lot more nuances, especially with the 2 main performances from Kathy Bates and James Caan that I feel like definitely stuck out to me, where I'm like, yeah, okay, I can see why people absolutely hype up this film as much as they do and everything.
Sure, yeah.
So
They were excellent.
Yeah, so definitely good stuff there. We'll go ahead and jump into the plot synopsis of Misery, where basically it focuses on an author, Paul Sheldon, who basically is leaving a cabin where he has just finished writing another novel, and as he's heading back, he ends up getting caught in a blizzard and ends up in a car crash, only to be saved by an individual who claims to be his number 1 fan, Annie Wilkes. So from that moment on, he has to figure out what he's going to do with being stuck in a blizzard and surviving from his injuries as he figures out more and more who Annie Wilkes is and everything. And I feel like the plot is pretty dadgum solid. I mean, I feel like that's one of the interesting things about Stephen King, because I believe he said that the idea came across as sort of being like the ultimate nightmare for an author.
Yeah, it's not hard to see how this would be scary for Stephen King to write. It's not hard to see the parallels between Paul and Stephen himself. So.
Yeah, so I think it's just a solid idea. It's like super simple yet really effective whenever it comes to telling the story. The only thing I will say about the plot is that while it's still very good and everything, it definitely feels like a slow moving film and everything. And it's not bad or whatever. There's definitely some moments where you feel like, okay, you're just kind of like,
You're trapped.
Yeah, you're trapped.
In a blizzard.
Yes, exactly. But it's not bad innately, and I think that was like one of the things that I may have been bothered by, is because I'm so used to like more like, oh man, there's something going on everywhere,
Yeah.
but this kind of like stews in sort of the isolation
Yeah.
of it and just making you feel more trapped in everything.
It's
So
not unlike The Shining in that way, or a lot of Stephen King works really, where it's about the suspense that builds over time. But I think one of my criticisms as well is along those lines, where I think when you adapt something like this to film, it's hard because when you're writing a book, you don't have to think about sets, But this entire movie, for the most part, was set in like one room in a house, you know what I mean? So it's really hard to make that interesting. I thought they did a phenomenal job at, doing a little more dynamic, getting out of that room when they can. But, I mean, that still, you got to follow the storyline, and he's stuck in that room. That's the story. So,
yeah, it's like one of those things where it's not even like a criticism of why don't you do this, why don't you do that. It's just a criticism that pops up with the innate plot that there's really kind of
that's just something that's going to happen when you adapt this particular story to film, I think.
But that being said, even though it is like a slight criticism there, I don't mind it. I said, there's definitely a lot to be enjoyed, and I feel like overall the plot, the way they continue the plot forward and everything is done interestingly. It's very interesting the way they continue the plot to carry on and everything. Because I truly never felt like, okay, this is going to happen next, and I knew roughly, obviously watching it a second time, what the rough plot is and everything, but I had forgotten a lot of the in-betweens. Like, I knew kind of beginning, middle, end, but
those key details,
so kind of seeing it again, I was just sort of like, I don't know where this is going and everything. Like, you assume it's going to go one way or another towards the end, but in between, you're just like, I don't know. This is just a bad situation and everything.
I do think they did a pretty good job of getting us out of the house a little bit with this, and moving the pace along a little bit with the sort of subplot of the sheriff slash chief police officer guy. The small town, all of the above category law enforcement guy who's slowly searching for Paul. But it's even then it's one of those things where the pacing of both plot lines is a little slow.
Yeah, but I'm definitely grateful for the subplot, because I feel like if the subplot was not present, then I do feel like the main plot would kind of suffer even more because of it and everything.
Absolutely.
So
it's necessary to like go back and forth between something else. So we're not just watching Paul eat soup for the first 30 minutes.
Yeah, and I will say, surprisingly, I never felt like if we ever went to the subplot, I was never like, oh, go back to the main plot.
Right. Sometimes there's a B plot that you're just like, oh, this is stupid. I don't care about this.
Yes, like this is adding nothing to it.
Right,
but
both of them, they complement each other. Yeah, that's what you're about to say.
Nice. Yeah. All right. I'm glad we're on key with one another. So yeah, overall, like, we can't say too much about the plot without spoiling
As always.
stuff. So kind of overall, like, while there is some slight criticisms, it's mostly just pretty dadgum solid and great. So let's talk about some of the characters in the film. Obviously, we've mentioned James Caan is in the film, who plays Paul Sheldon. And I am going to be completely honest, I don't know how much of the character is James Caan adding to the role, or how much of a, like, what kind of character he is in the book or whatever, but I love the way that they have the character Paul, like, as a character, like...
Yeah, he's very well cast in that role, I think. He just has that demeanor of, like, yes, I'm best-selling author, Paul whatever,
Yeah, it's definitely very interesting, and they give him so many quirks, like, whether it's, like, his sort of ritual superstitions that he follows and everything, or just... even just the way he chooses to approach certain scenarios and everything, I think it's great, because I feel like No, man, it's so difficult without trying to spoil stuff. I feel like characters that are in this scenario start to kind of blend and be the same, and you kind of go through the same emotions and everything.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas he goes through a lot of the same emotions, but then he projects it a different way while also just reacting slightly different enough to where it keeps it fresh and everything. But yeah, no, definitely it's I feel like they just also do a good job of him on the most part just keeping it fairly neutral, because it's like you mentioned or whatever, he is a little bit jaded, a little bit, because the series he's best known for he's kind of like tired of and everything. So yeah, I think he does have kind of that, you know, better than others sort of mentality, but I never felt like it ever got to where you ever disliked a guy. It's just like,
Right.
yeah.
It's like you can tell he's sort of at the end of his career, but he's not, proud of what he's done, because he's sort of taken the route of writing books that are popular for money rather than writing what you'd consider something that's literary and that, the critics would like, but popular audiences might not, And so it's something that he thinks is he's something he's writing for himself, I guess, more than anything. But, yeah, I think that's a really funny scenario to go in, because that's really, I mean, at this point in Stephen King's career, probably what he was being criticized the most for. I know, as somebody who's an English major and a creative writing major who's heard professors literally discuss Stephen King. I had one, seriously, that we would write all our favorite authors at the beginning of the class period, because I had this professor several times. She'd do it every time. And then anyone that mentioned Stephen King, she'd be like, and then she'd go through the list and she'd tell you which authors are good or not.
I remember you told me that a while ago.
And she would always land on, because somebody would inevitably say Stephen King, and she would always land on Stephen King and say that, he's the one that breaks my heart the most, because if he wanted to, he could be a literary writer, but he's not. He writes genre, which is horror,
Oh my God.
That's what a lot of these, fancy schmancy literary critiques or, people that are in ivory towers think about Stephen King whenever, and now, so it's funny that he wrote, seriously, a character that's a mirror of himself, so somebody that seems to be a brilliant author, but is sticking to writing genre for money and not writing what, something for himself, I guess.
Yeah, and I think that's what helps kind of make him a very interesting character and everything. And like I said, I'd be curious if I could have a comparison reading book to movie, seeing how much of that character is in the book versus James Caan taking it, adapting it, or kind of creating it as his own. Because as is, I feel like James Caan, the amount of emotions he has to do, especially being in not able to move hardly at all, it's definitely a major acting feat, to say the least. So he did an absolutely brilliant job and everything, it was...
And he did so much with being able to do so little, because he's, post-car crash for the vast majority of the movie, and so he's not acting with his body necessarily in the sense of hello,
Yeah.
He's confined to being a stiff kind of guy, but he does so much with just his expressions and just little movements and mannerisms that I think really sell the scenario that this guy's trapped in. But...
Yeah, so I definitely give major kudos to him, but if you're asking me in my honest opinion who the number one acting star is and everything, it has to be Kathy Bates playing Annie Wilkes. And again,
she's amazing.
Yeah, it's no diss on James Caan. I think it's just the fact that the character Annie Wilkes is a lot more of a very diverse character.
Yeah, you have a lot of range you gotta explore, and boy does Kathy Bates hit every corner of that range.
Yeah, it's super crazy just to kind of watch her perform and everything, and without giving too much away, she's not the most balanced person you'll meet there, and so because of that, her acting range is super huge and everything, and whenever it comes to certain scenarios, you're not sure what mood she's going to be in.
Yeah, it's it is so fascinating just watching the two of them. You don't even really need the subplot. It's helpful, don't get me wrong, but like just watching the two of them be in a room for like 90 minutes, I would watch that movie still. Like they're just the way they have to interact with each other, and it's like pins and needles, and it's you never know. And he's trying to make sure that she's not gonna be upset, but you never know. You just never know. It's great. It's a great formula for suspense. So that's sort of what I think what Stephen King does best, from what I could tell, is creating these unique scenarios to find suspense in.
Yeah, I would definitely agree, because like again, the one thing that is interesting, I think, is Stephen King's able to take that perspective of somebody who is this author's number one fan, reads all the books, is super obsessed with every detail, and that's their entire life, is that individual. So they kind of herald him as just a god almost and everything. But being in the situation where, the author is not able to escape and is just kind of subjugated to his number one fan's mercy, I think is sort of just a terrifying scenario to have and everything. But I think the thing that also, like, to give major credit to Kathy Bates, is the fact that whenever she does have mood shifts and everything, it never feels like unrealistic or cheap. It definitely feels grounded. But the thing that's most unsettling is the fact that whenever she's being super nice and caring, it's genuinely believable. Like, if you looked at it or whatever, you just think like, oh, she's a quirky, fun, nice little gal and everything. But whenever she has to click, it's pretty terrifying. And like I said, I don't know. Characters like Annie can be easy and difficult at the same time. Like, it's easy to, it's like, I don't know if you've ever known this, but everybody seems to have like a Joker impersonation. Like everybody in the world are like, oh, I could do it. And it's like, right, you could do it, but only truly like a select few get it right and everything. Because I feel like everybody wants to be kind of the, they're not so, all together person.
They want to lean into the instability aspect.
But
I got these scars.
well, and like they just, I don't know. Like, I feel like it's one of those things that, like, it's easy to do. It's like hard to master. And this is truly like a master class sort of thing, which I believe, I could be mistaken, but I believe that Kathy Bates actually won an Oscar for this film.
I'd hope so. She knocked it out of the park.
Let me see. I'm trying to see. Yes, she won the Oscar in 91. I was trying to make sure to confirm that because I didn't want to be lying, but she won the Oscar for it, which is funny because, as we mentioned on the podcast before, horror is not really one of those genres that's heralded, especially whenever it comes to the Academy Awards. Which, of course, because like it was in the Academy Awards, they labeled this more as suspense than horror, which I'm like, sure, but it's still horror and everything. They just don't want to address it as that, but that she gives very much an Oscar-worthy performance. I genuinely can't think of a single time where I was just like,
you kind of phoned that one in, Kathy.
You phoned that one in. I don't believe you. Because not only that, because you have like the highs and lows, but then you have like moments where it takes it in a totally different direction, especially towards the end of the film. There's moments where you're like, I wasn't expecting this. I don't know what to feel, but it's not good. And so I could definitely talk more about those turns and shifts that occur in the spoiler territory. But like, it's genuinely like both James Caan and Kathy Bates give hell of performances, like just top notch, top tier. And I think like if either one of them was weak, the story would falter greatly there. So yeah, I unfortunately can't talk too much more about it, but I'll probably rave more about it later and everything. One actor I do have to give kudos to and everything is Bustard, played by Richard Farnsworth, who is the like basically town sheriff, chief of police and everything, basically runs the little town of Silver Creek. And he's contacted by James Caan's agent, to basically ask like, hey, have you seen him? He hasn't returned. And he's like, oh, I don't know, I could check out. And he has like that simple sort of like small town sheriff sort of sleuthing and everything. And I don't know what it is. I'm a sucker for that.
Yeah, they do it really well in the script. I mean, I think he's accentuated perfectly by his like wife / deputy.
Yes, it's
That's
so good.
The only other person that works in the department, and yeah, it brings out all of the charm of small town stuff. They talk like small town people to each other. I mean, they have like a running joke in there about something about. That sarcasm is what keeps the spice in our marriage alive, or whatever. And they deliver it all in that slow. They're not in a big hurry to do anything, but they are gonna do it right, you know?
Yeah, and it's just one of those things that like you watch these films where they're trying to find somebody, and you feel like, well, we can't have them find them quite yet. How do we mislead them? We make them stupid as hell,
Right?
But this genuinely just felt like. Yeah, like, I could see how they can miss that and everything.
You know what it felt like to me? If you ever seen Fargo.
Yes, it's so Fargo-esque.
I love the cop from Fargo. Who's like,
She is so good.
You know? You can tell she's like, they don't make her stupid. She's excellent at her job. She's actually kind of brilliant, but she's just very small town, simple. All right, well, okay then. You know?
Yeah, and, you know, they just look at stuff that they normally wouldn't, and I do love that they have, like, a moment where they decide, like, you know, the sheriff brings his books and he's like, well, I don't know, I don't really know anything about this guy, so maybe if I read his work I'll understand him a little better.
Yeah.
And again, it's just sort of like, you know, is it a little like too like fictional, like, you know, oh, we need to read the stories to find this out? A little bit, but like for me, at the very least, I'm willing to give it a pass because I'm just like, I think it's a nice story element.
Yeah, and it's one of those things I believe because they've already set up beforehand that like not dick happens in this town. Like, so like, yeah, he's just got time to sit back and read, you know.
So yeah, he gives like a good solid performance, and again, he's sort of like leading the subplot there. So him and his wife Virginia, played by Frances Sternhagen, they're just like fun to watch with their bits and banter and everything, and that's what helps, you know, coast along with the film, because the film's like about an hour and 40 minutes there. So I definitely can't imagine what an hour 40 would be like if they literally just trapped us with Annie Wilkes and Paul and everything.
Yeah. Gotta get out of that.
Yeah, because by the end of the story, I never felt like I was like, you know how with, oh my gosh, 10 Cloverfield Lane, I was like, I could have done more John Goodman parts and everything.
Yeah.
I never felt that way with this film. I felt like they gave us just enough.
And you know what one of my criticisms of 10 Cloverfield Lane was? Is we're in the bunker the whole fucking time.
Yes, that's true. That's very true. Aside from that ending, goddamn.
Right. I mean, yes.
Yes.
They're not there literally the whole time. But
yes.
there's no side plot where you can escape from the fucking 2 rooms in that set or whatever.
Yes, and so I think this is like definitely an improvement. It just helps kind of not only just show us like, hey, stuff's going on out here that's actively being done, but again, just gives us a break and everything.
Yeah. So
it's really nice. One thing I do want to compliment is the overall lighting, because especially whenever it comes to needing to enhance the presence of Kathy Bates and everything, the lighting just works perfectly with her demeanor and everything. Like, it just already, it'd be unsettling if it was broad daylight. The lighting just sells it perfectly to where it's like, yeah, I'd be kind of, I'm like a little freaking unnerved right now, and nothing horrific's happening, like super scary, but it's just super like just disturbs and everything. So
yeah, I think lighting and just set design in general, I mean, is I mean, I know that we are trapped into one home for a lot of the movie, but they do their best to make that a very visually interesting whenever you get to see little extra parts of the house or this, that, or the other. I mean, I love the details and the way that they lit the whole house even, and just to give it an atmosphere that's not sinister but is also like, because it's just somebody's house, but there's also like a little something off, like the set matches the character.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it's like kind of like what we've talked about with some of these places, that sort of like the owner's house reflects who they are, is kind of like window to their personality, kind of like they did in Psycho.
Absolutely.
And everything.
Yeah.
So I feel like they did a good job without, because I feel like, again, sort of whenever it comes to trying to make a house unsettling, they'll take like too easy of the routes and do like innately like stuff that you're like, yeah, no kidding, this is creepy,
Right.
But at the same point, they have enough stuff there to where you're just like, if I was hanging here, I'd be a little uncomfortable, not gonna lie.
Exactly.
So.
Yeah, and I think that's a lot harder to pull off, to just make it a little eerie, and not like, the last Texas Chainsaw Massacre we watched.
Yes, that's what I'm talking
Wouldn't it
about.
be crazy if this was like,
Look at all these keys.
Yeah, isn't that wacky? It's like, okay, yeah.
Oh,
It's like the equivalent of like, this house is haunted, so it's got spider webs. And it's like, okay, you hit the basics, I guess.
But yeah, and I guess one question I do want to ask you is, how scary did you find this film overall? Like,
I would put it on par with basically every other Stephen King movie that we've watched. It's not like scary, but it's like, it's suspenseful. Yeah, it builds up that unnerving nature over time, but it's not like jump scare, ooh, this monster's, whoa, It's just like, it's that sort of psychological terror that compounds over time.
Yeah, I was curious about it for multiple things, because I do feel like the horror takes a while to start kicking in, but I know they're kind of busy setting up the pieces, which I don't mind, but it was definitely odd, because in my head I remember the horror arriving earlier, because I'm compressing the story down in my mind.
Right.
But the other thing is that while watching it, I heard you giggle a lot and everything, which I was curious if that was more so like you just thought it was funny, or you were just so uncomfortable that...
No, I thought they did a really good job with the writing of right from the very beginning of every line that this woman says, like, it'll be normal, and then there's just like one little detail or like something where you're like, excuse me? Like,
yeah.
And so I thought they did a really clever job of like, there's red flags all throughout, you know what I mean? And it's like, I have talked to people that, there's also some lines that remind me of people in my life that I've known that I'm like, that's so funny that they say, like, how she mentions, and I'll end this by cleaning up what I mean, but I guess whenever she's talking about like, God told me this.
Oh, yeah.
just to like make a grand determination that you can't argue against or whatever. Like, I have known people that have been like, God told me this, like, out loud, and I'm like, okay. And it's just like because they needed to believe something, and I'm like, okay. And it's just the moments where she does stuff like that. It's like, what do you say to that? Like, what do you? And it just, and his reactions are perfect. He's like, oh, like,
yeah, like it's so like, I just feel like it's in. I think you're right on the money about that, because I was glad to like hear you laughing at that, because I don't know what it is with my mongoloid brain sometimes, but I feel like it's like I need affirmation of that's a funny line. Like I need like the sitcom audience laughter, just to kind of resonate how funny a line is or something. But I think you hit it right on the money. It's just the fact that some of the stuff they said is so funny, and it also comes from the fact it's so uncomfortable, but also James Caan's expressions just perfectly captured like someone, what would you do if someone said that? And it's just sort of like an eyebrow raise.
Right. Someone was in a very uncomfortable situation, but they can't escape, so you have to be cordial, And it's like, yes, I recognize this.
Yeah. But yeah, aside from that, anything else you did want to talk about the film? I know it's kind of tricky since there's lots of sudden surprises that pop up in the film.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, I think we hit the main points. Yeah, no, Kathy Bates, amazing, 10 out of 10 performance. James Caan too. I mean, really, there's not an actor's performance in this thing that I could say bad about, really. I'm trying to think that everybody sticks out to some degree. I don't know.
I think you're right. I don't really think there was one where I'm like, oh, this guy. This but yeah, so I guess with that said, let's go ahead and give our ratings for the film. Erin, what do you rate Misery?
Yeah, well, my critiques are few. We've gone over basically all of them. And it's it's a slower burn, take that or leave it. And it's, the set can be limiting by the nature of the story a little bit, but they do what they can to get around that. I think overall, I mean, there's so much to be praised with this movie that I can't help but give it a high score. I think this is really on par with, a lot of other very famous and very good Stephen King movies, so I would rate it similarly to those. This is like a 9 out of 10 for me. Yeah, I mean, really good, really excellent concept. I give it extra points, too, for, like, doing something that I'm usually very critical of, which is writing a story about writing, which is just something that writers do a lot, because you write what you know, but it becomes sort of like a trope that's really boring and sucks. But, of course, Stephen King and, whoever adapted this to film and directed it did a very good job of, keeping that interesting to people that aren't writers and to people that are, and not making it fucking, one of those stories where it just seems like you're self-aggrandizing. Even as Stephen King writes a character that is probably his most self-insert character possible. It doesn't feel like he's just like jerking himself off or whatever, like a lot of times. So, I give it extra points for pulling off a lot of things that I think are difficult, having a movie that's with such a limited setting, having these characters with very nuanced performances and nailing them, I think it did really well for itself. So that's a 9 out of 10 for me.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that, but and you're not the only one that's a fan of the adaptation. Rob Reiner directed it, and not only that, Stephen King has gone on record saying that Misery is one of his favorite film adaptations of his books, where he's just very much a big fan of it. But yeah, I'm pretty much right on the line with you. There is very little to fault with this film and everything else. I feel like the only thing that holds it back is the fact that it does feel like, there are moments where stuff is happening, but it's just very slow. So I never felt like there's nothing going on, like, why didn't they trim this up or whatever? It's just one of those things I kind of looking at it. It's just like, okay, yeah, it's going on a little bit long and everything else. So that's about probably the biggest criticism I have. And whenever it comes to the ending, I like the ending a lot. I do feel like it does feel like once we get towards the climax, it's like it makes me feel like they looked at the film they had and are like, shit, we only have this much left. And it's like, let's compress this down. But it didn't feel entirely rushed. It just felt a little too fast paced there, a little bit. But that's like literally nitpicking, like very nitpicking and everything. So I'm not even going to like say like, oh, that's a valid criticism. I can't change my friggin' mind. But overall, it's a solid damn adaptation of Stephen King's book there, put the film, so I can understand why people rant and rave about it. So with that said, I probably will also place this at probably about 8.59, just around there and everything. So I'm up there as well. Not my favorite adaptation. That'd always be The Shining, which I'm sure makes Stephen King very happy that Stanley Kubrick's Shining is my favorite, but it'd be what it be. So that's our ratings for the movie. Definitely recommend checking it out if you can. Just grab yourself a copy, rent it online, just do whatevs, because especially with the wintry season in place, it's just a very good thematic film to watch. So we going to go ahead and talk about spoilers now. So go on now, get
go on scream.
All right, bud, take it away with the first spoiler.
Whenever he wrecks off the side of the road, Boy, I did think it was strange that the first thing the person that drug him out of the car did was give him CPR mouth to mouth. And then whenever you met the character that Kathy Bates plays, and she's like, "I'm your biggest fan," or whatever, that's when I think I let out a giggle, and I was like thinking at that moment, like, it is funny now thinking back that the first thing she did was just put her lips on him. But I mean, he was near death, but I think that was probably her plan from the start. Was
Yeah.
start macking.
God, yeah, just be like, I'm saving your life.
Stop resisting. Save.
Doing that. That's one of my actually favorite things about Annie Wilkes as a character is the fact that in order to kind of just really even make her more of an intimidating force, she is not a pushover. She runs a farm by herself, so it definitely is strong, because that's one of the things you see as well, is she literally like picks James Caan up over her shoulders and carry through snow. Of course, at the time, you don't know it's her because they're covering her up, trying to make it inconspicuous on who the individual is.
Yeah, and there's a huge blizzard that's like blowing snow in blowing snow in his mouth when she's trying to give him CPR, and then just brushes it off. And I thought it was great detail, the heavy blizzard that they were in. But
yeah, it was. It really was and everything. But man, like I said, I cannot get enough about how much time they spend making her be like a very sweet individual and everything.
Yeah, well, I think that's what makes the scary part scary, is that it's all like, it's not like this person hates them. It's they love them. You know what I mean? Like, she doesn't hate Paul. She loves Paul so much that she gets so passionate and round up, then it builds into this. I mean, I think that's more terrifying than somebody that's just like, I have you locked in the room and I hate you, and I'm going to come in and be like, nana boo boo every day or something, It's like she loves him so much that she's going to kill him, and he knows this, and he's like trying to work a way out.
Yeah, and that's like, again, I feel like it's just easy to sort of be like I'm psychotic, but I'm being social and nice and doing that. Like, it's just one of those things where, again, you just genuinely feel like she's definitely just an odd, quirky person, but you would never expect her to be like full psycho or anything else like that.
Kind of like that in real life too. I mean, like when I pass the homeless guy that's not like on something right now outside a Quick Trip, and he's just like, blah, blah, I'm like, all right, I don't feel like necessarily like I'm not gonna walk right next to him. I don't feel like as threatened to that guy as I would by like somebody that's in my face smiling like I love you, and I'm just like they're like I can tell one is unhinged, and the other one is some more subtle. It's a more scary version.
Yeah, and it's so like well done. And one of the moments that does show a glimpse of her anger and everything is just talking about the overall like language that she was reading in the first draft of his novel and everything.
Yeah, because she doesn't curse or anything.
Cocky doodle. Yeah. Doing that, but just like the way she gets upset is unfortunately believable, but not in the sense that you would think of like, oh, it makes sense she would get upset about that. No, but just like saying like, what, you think us small town folks talk about that? I need a big effing bag. He's like, give me a big old bastard.
Yeah, you could tell the mask she wears just like slips like right from the beginning, and it starts to slip off a little bit more every time until she's just full crazy beans by the end.
Yeah, and it's funny because like there a lot of choices. Anytime there's like a character that has an outburst, they immediately refer to like, oh, I'm sorry, just act like nothing's wrong. But she makes a deliberate choice of being like, oh, I'm sorry, and then it's just more reserved and disturbed and everything, and I think that was just a way better acting decision.
It's more accurate too, I think, to people that are abusers. People I mean, they recognize like somebody that beats the shit out of somebody. I mean, they recognize they did something wrong. They justify it, cover up, they blah blah blah. But at first they're like, oh, I'm so sorry I did that, and then it turns into, and this happens in the film too. It turns into, you made me do this. Yes, but it starts with like, I'm sorry, it won't happen again.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, and that's like the tricky thing too, is like, she would have like an explosion, walk away, and then come back, you're like, hey, I'm sorry about that,
Right. And he just has to be like, it happens.
Has to play along, gang. That's another thing that, again, I give like Stephen credit for when writing this book, because I'm sure that she's also a nurse in the book, but like that's just also another smart play to keep him in the house alive and everything, because basically she knows how to control him.
And I'm surprised, honestly. I thought she was just botching it because his legs looked so fucked up for so long. I thought they were all infected, and like that was gonna be like she's not even a nurse or something. But no, but she was. But yeah.
And I think that just helps aid the story. But yeah, you have that first blow up or whatever, and you're just like, wow, okay. And then like as the story continues on, because she got the latest Misery book, which I did want to ask, what did you think about finally understanding why it's called Misery?
Well, wait, what do you mean? Why it's called Misery?
Because I didn't know
the
if
movie's called Misery?
Well, right. No.
Why his book in the movie is called
I was asking your thoughts on it, because I'm sure you saw
yeah.
the movie, you're like, why is it called Misery?
Right.
And then you hear about Misery being the girl's name of the novel.
I kind of love that, because I feel like it sneaks in, like, the fact that even when he started writing these novels, he wasn't, like, he's like, oh, I'm writing trash. You know what I mean?
Yes.
He names the main character Misery, and then it ends up being, and it's his misery. It's the misery of his career or whatever. But then it ends up, obviously being more symbolic of the miserable situation he finds himself in, like, the room trapped in with his audience, which the whole thing is, I mean, when you think about it, it's a symbol of the writer's plight. He's literally trapped in here with his biggest fan that disagrees with him ending her favorite series, you know what I mean, and is giving him the most hate possible. I mean, this is not uncommon whenever something like that happens in real life, and then writers get death threats about it. Like, yeah,
and let's talk more about that scene, because I think that's the penultimate, like,
and that's the one that I knew was coming from the beginning, because it's like, yeah, that's how they set up the movie. He's like, I'm tired of this, I'm gonna go write something different, and now that this book is out, Misery is dead, great. And then like from the beginning, once he was in the bed and he's like, I'm your biggest fan, I love the Misery books, I was like, this is where she's gonna break. Like, and you're just waiting for that to happen.
Yeah, because like I feel like it's hard sometimes whenever it comes to foreshadowing or whatever, because sometimes you could do foreshadowing and you're like, yeah, this is gonna happen next, and it kind of takes away from the film. But like literally them being at the beginning, you're like, wow, you're killing Misery. He's like, yeah, I'm done with the series, I want to do something different. And she's like, I'm your number one fan, I love Misery, and even names her pig Misery and everything. It's less of like, oh well, she's going to freak out later, and then instead it's like, oh fuck, she's going to freak out later. So it's just sort of like that tension, but again, they don't really rub it in your face.
No.
Like, they don't.
They just give you the pieces. They give you that one little break that she has over him writing bad words or whatever, and you're like, okay, that gives me enough clue to know that if she freaks out that much about this, she's gonna lose her fucking shit about Misery Dog.
But I think like that's sort of like the interesting thing, because they instead like don't really make Paul like worried about her finishing the book. Yeah. Because in his mind, he's just like, oh, okay, she doesn't like cursing, but she's loving the book so far,
right,
and everything. I'm sure she'll be fine with it being the conclusive end.
What?
Instead of like, sweating bullets, like, maybe she'll read the book, or something like that. But like just that initial like shock of like him waking up and seeing her at the foot of the bed, staring dead eyes at him with like the rain and the lighting, like that shot is just, even now it's just imprinted into my mind as highly disturbing and everything. And she starts just yelling at him, shaking the bed and everything.
She picks up that wooden end table or whatever and is like about to hit him with it, then just breaks it over the wall on top of him.
Which is funny, because like you talk about like how it's very, very relevant to today, and this film came out in 1990 and everything. So the fact that we're dealing with that still with like movies, like whether a character's like an awful jerk or anything like that, and people are literally unhinged to where they will send death threats to people because they just hate them that much. Unfortunately, makes Annie Wilkes a fairly grounded character.
She's so believable. And I love the choices that they make that are consistent with what you would think of like this type of abuser is. Like she goes to hit him in the head because she wants to hurt him because he hurt her, she took misery away or whatever, but then he's the one that she loves so much. She can't hit him over the head this time. Whatever. It's not until her anger gets out of control that she finds a way to make the violence into love, which is like, you know, at the end, ultimately, we got to die together because God told me, you know.
It's a very powerful scene and everything, and just really heightens sort of the severity of the situation. There's already that small blow up, which I feel like definitely was good to have that small blow up moment before the ultimate sort of freak out moment and everything.
You gotta build it up. Yeah, absolutely.
And I do like that he, you know, it sounds like a legit sort of situation that an author would say towards a fan about killing like the main character of a series, and him being like, I just needed the end of this story and everything. It's fine. It's like, it's a character, and to them it's like surreal. Like it's everything to them.
Because to them it is real.
So did you ever expect where it would go from there after sort of realizing she misery died and everything? Because like at that moment I was just like, where do you even go from here?
Well, like at that point it felt like the movie was on, and like a lot of the suspense was coming from the collision course of the two braided narratives, right? You know, the cop is he's on the trail, he's slow, but he's slowly getting somewhere, and you know he's gonna get there eventually, you know what I mean? And you know, so there's like a train heading towards the good ending, and then there's the train heading towards the bad ending, which is every moment gets a little bit worse, and you know it's getting sketchier and closer to a moment where Paul thinks he's gonna die, you know, and you know those two are gonna come colliding eventually, and then I wasn't sure what was gonna happen then, you know, is he gonna be rescued, is he what, you know, but I did think once I saw the cop standing at the top of the stairs though, I was like, he's gonna get shot.
That was like pretty much like ultimate sort of like you're like game over screen basically.
I love how they tease that too in the way that a lot of slashers tend to, where you get the killer's POV when he's like in her room like looking around for clues or whatever, and the camera is sort of her POV, and then she appears behind him with, you know, the cup of hot cocoa or whatever. But no, I love how that it's like just cinematically too, they like play on these existing horror tropes that exist by this point in the 90s when this movie came out, and then, you know, really, so you even without saying anything, without hinting anything, without any of the characters making any choices, you know, the movie sort of is like, all right, well, here's the killer and here's the victim, you know, and then shortly thereafter the sheriff does die.
Yeah, no, that was definitely a good hell of a shot there and everything. And again, with that's one of the interesting things about the film is the fact there's not so much violence, but anytime there is violence, it's just heightened because of it and everything.
Right, yeah.
Because one of the things I will talk about is there's obviously that one scene where basically the shotgun blast, it's like brutal. You see like a chunk of his chest fly out as he falls down and everything. And that's probably the bloodiest part of the film.
Oh, yeah.
Well, almost. Well, yeah, basically. Anyways, yeah, I had to like bat around in my head, but one of the scenes where basically we're going to be jumping around a lot in this review and everything, but whenever we get to probably one of the other big infamous scenes in the bed with hobbling and everything,
that one was like, wow.
Because basically she finds out that as he's gotten better and everything, he's been going around the house more and like trying to take things and try to use it to escape, which there's so many instances we'll have to talk about and everything, but that scene, believe it or not, in the book, if I remember correctly, it's not hobbling, but instead it's she takes an axe to his feet and cuts it off, which apparently for this film and everything they couldn't do at all because they would receive too high of a rating. So they were like, okay, well, I guess we'll do hobbling. And at the end of it, he's like, you know what? I feel like the hobbling was a lot more effective than the axe would have been.
Yeah, and I love how she justifies it too with this obscure, like, did you know what they did to miners when they tried to escape the whatever mines in Africa or whatever? Because they did this technique called hobbling as they're like setting it up. It's like, yes, it's such a like, yeah, this is the former head nurse or whatever that's doing all this violence in her mind in a structured way, you know, like administering morphine to this guy isn't violence, even though because I'm taking care of him, he's my patient or whatever. And he's like, hobbling is just a way to keep him from escaping, not I'm literally breaking his feet with a sledgehammer, you know. It's yeah, I thought it was perfect, and it was one of those things where I just believe it because of everything they baked into the character, not just Kathy's performance, but just all the little details. I mean, she's a farmhand that's been doing all this stuff by herself. She's probably used to killing an animal or two. I mean, she says she has pigs and cows and stuff, so it's like, yeah, I mean, you're just slaughtering them, like, she, you know. And she's a nurse, and then of course, obviously, they go through her backstory with the newspaper prints of her baby killing adventures and husband kill. So it's not like she's, you know, afraid of violence. It's just coming from her. That's not how she views it, you know. It's so interesting.
Yeah, I just felt like the whole scene was set up like very perfectly, because there's also like a lot of things set up to where you think it's going to come into play later. Like one of the things is that Paul, whenever he's like getting around better, because he has his whole process down whenever he found a hairpin that dropped on the ground, that he then picks up and is using it, and he has a system where he roams the house. It's just the fact that too many things happened to where and he is able to recognize it, and it's like, okay, you've been escaping. But even before that happens, he stole a kitchen knife that he eyed like a long time ago whenever he first escaped, and you know, it's like he's being aware that I see that this is there, I will remember it for later. And once he's strong enough, he's able to grab it, and he practices trying to stab by pulling the knife from the cast.
Yeah, the little sling that his arm's in.
Yeah, and it reminds me of that scene from Breaking Bad where Walt buys the gun and is practicing shooting.
I thought you were going to say the plate whenever he gets
yes!
He's like, yeah.
Yeah. Doing that, in all honesty, that's a lot more accurate, but they're playing it up, and you're like, okay, yeah, he's going to get ready for it. But then they subvert the expectation whenever you see her in a room where she has like the syringe, the sedative to put him to sleep, and whenever he wakes up, sees that he's belted to the bed and everything. But not only that, as he tries to grab the knife from the side, she's already made aware, because again, she was just searching the bed for everything, and she only knew because they have like an early tease where you see him knock a ceramic penguin like off, and he manages to catch it, but then he places it in like the incorrect side.
Yeah, he has it turned a different direction, because she says something about like he always faces north or something, you know.
Yeah, something crazy like that, and it's like, yeah, I buy that she would recognize that. But the whole setup there where she's speaking fairly calmly, she's not being angry or menacing, but she's breaking out the wood block, setting it there as Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata is playing, and then the wax and everything, it just, yeah, like both performances from Kathy, taking that swing, and James Caan just writhing in pain is just sold beautifully, to where I'm like, yeah, I believe this. I believe this. So I think that's one of the changes from the book that I think, like, you know, like, yeah, the axes are probably a lot more graphic and shocking with just like blood, flesh being shown, but the hobbling is just somehow equally as bad.
Yeah, it's just, it's one of those things. It's like watching, you know, people like knife to an eyeball, or like anything under the fingernails, you know. It's one of those things like, oh, just like watching an ankle be broken with a sledgehammer is crazy.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. And like I said, there's so much that they set up leading up to this moment, because it's insane to me, like the measures Annie as a character decides to take against Paul, like having him burn his draft for his new novel, because it's like, this is not you.
Right.
This is not you. You're going to burn it and everything. And I do love the back and forth that they have with one another, because he basically tries to bluff his way out of it. And he's like, I mean, you could burn that copy if you want. There's a billion copies already handed out. It's still going to be published. Like, what's there to have? But she knows him so dadgum well in his superstitious nature, where she's like, oh, I know you. This is the only draft, because the first book you published, you only ever had one draft, and you've done it ever since. So I know you're lying about this. And it just kind of sucks to imagine working on a book that you're like, this is my new beginning and everything. Yeah. It's just kind of symbolic.
Right.
And then you're literally having to burn it away.
Yeah, and he's already, like, in the beginning, because he's pretty close to finishing it when he's calling his editor or whatever, and he says something about, like, yeah, like, this might be one that I'm proud to put on my tombstone or whatever, which is a funny line.
Yes.
Foreshadow, but it's also, like, you know, this is, like, his magnum opus or whatever, and then to make him burn it is like the worst thing you could do to a writer. So like that's exactly why Stephen King put that part in, I'm sure.
Well, and speaking of the worst thing you could do to a writer, I love the setup, the grand plan that she has, where she's like, I have a brilliant idea. You're going to write the next Misery book where you make sure that she's actually alive and not dead.
Returns, yeah.
Yes, Misery Returns. Yeah. And setting that up and having to type, and even buying like a typewriter and paper and everything. Just a whole thing. So I just imagine that's also just like, yeah, I'm sure Stephen King like was hitting pretty close to home whenever it came to his like personal fears as an author.
Yeah.
Doing that. But again, I like how they handle it, because they never really make Paul sort of like completely like insecure, scared. Like he still continues to be strong even though he's in the worst situation. But he also acknowledges that I can't win. I cannot win with this. But I do love how he's able to like take little threads, little ideas, which I think, you know, I believe him. He's a writer. He has to think creatively about how people escape out of situations and everything. And he's able to notice like, oh, Annie dropped a hairpin on the floor. I'm going to use that later to try to get out. And also, but how do I get her gone out of the house? Oh, this paper she bought, which is really nice, actually has one flaw with it because it smudges. And I do like how, again, there's deliberate choices that they make for Annie's character on when to freak out versus not. Because she doesn't freak out at every little thing. It's just sort of kind of random stuff.
But it's like random stuff that makes sense once you see it.
Correct.
It's like, it's her fear of rejection or whatever that's being triggered whenever she did something wrong, when it is supposed to be perfect. Whatever.
I didn't even pick up on that. That's super smart. Because the paper, she's just like, oh, can I get you anything else?
Yeah, she's like, oh, as I didn't do it right, you need to appreciate me or whatever. Yeah. She's like, but it's like, it's because she did something that she knew was perfect for this guy that she knows everything about. She knows everything about him or whatever, and then she messed up the paper. And it's like, so that turns into like I didn't do it right, you know. That's why she has that weird little quirk where she's like, did I do good?
Yeah.
And he has to be like, you did wonderfully. And she's like, oh,
yeah,
because like she needs the validation, and as soon as she sees one little thing that's not, you know, that's not signaling validation, but that signals the opposite to her, she blows it up in her mind, and it unravels and burns, and she's like, because she doesn't blow up right away. She's like, you know, she can see she's a little shocked, and then she looks down, she's disappointed, you know, she runs through the emotions, and then she's like, and then it just starts with a little comment, you know, like, well, is there anything else? I'll get you the whole story, you know, like, and then it bubbles and bubbles because she's just like, she stews on this one little thing that's wrong, you know, the penguin wasn't facing north, you know, that's how her mind works. You know?
I also love the tiniest detail, which again, this seems like a Stephen King detail, but I love that the typewriter, she's like, I was able to get $50 off because it doesn't have the N on it.
Yeah, I noticed that, and I knew that, like, that must mean something that I didn't pick up on. But, like, why didn't it have the N? It must be some sort of something.
Yeah, I'm sure it probably is, but I do love that whenever you see him type, literally every part that needs the letter N is gone.
Yeah.
So I'm like, man, that's just, like, major commitment, and kudos to being able to type that and everything. But, yeah, it's just very well done. And again, just having him explore the house and how different it is, like whenever he first tries to explore the house and everything, He's a bit more clumsy with it, a lot more weaker whenever it comes to moving. And I do love like how he tries to rush back to the room. He's like dripping in sweat or whatever.
Yeah.
And again, he's having to understand Annie as a character and manipulate her in order to get him what he needs or wants, which I think again is just brilliant.
Right, yeah.
I think it's super brilliant, because I feel like a lot of hostage situations, the hostage is basically helpless,
Right.
but Paul isn't entirely helpless. He uses sort of like moments, like especially whenever he's like, I need to hide these pills I stole from the pantry or whatever, since she's in the room, so I'm just going to like really cry and beg to her and plead to her sympathy to give me some pills right now, so I have extra time to like shove it down my pants and everything. And again, there's like small moments he takes while planning and everything, because he stole like a whole like package of pills or whatever, and you see him take one of the typing pages to make like a little envelope and everything, and you start to see him like pour the powder into it, so you're like, okay, what does he have going on there? And whenever he asks her for you know, a dinner at the table or whatever, and they have the wine glasses set out and everything, he tries pouring it in whenever he asks her for some candles for the table and everything. And again, he's like schmoozing her up like nobody's business.
Yeah, he got to use what. Yeah, he's super smart in using what he has an advantage in, which is like, okay, this person's obsessed with me and loves me and wants to do whatever for me, so you can use that to his advantage when he can, and hopefully not trigger the crazy part. But.
Yeah, and that's just what makes it all the more heartbreaking whenever he successfully gets all of the pills that are like, I'm guessing sedatives or pain relievers.
Yeah, they were knocking him out, it seemed like. So.
And pours them all into the drink. And as she goes to place the candle there, knocks it over on the table, and she's like, oh gosh, I'm so sorry. And you can just see the grief across James Caan's eyes just looking at that.
His face just sinks, yeah.
Yeah, just sinks with that and everything. And then he has to play it off like it was just...
No worries, yeah.
Yes, doing that.
Pour you another glass.
And I do love him toasting to misery.
To misery, yeah.
Doing that. One other thing that I do like a ton is the fact that Annie is, as you mentioned, Aaron, very particular. So whenever it comes to like the first couple of chapters of him writing, she immediately is like, you have to redo it. This is unbelievable. Like, you know, experimental blood transfusion. Like, what is this? You know, this is ridiculous. And then she correlates it to like a moment in her childhood watching like some theater shorts where they would end on cliffhangers. Yes, exactly. And her being really angry that one of the chapter shows she was waiting for, how the guy would get out of it, was done unrealistically. So I also just love how particular she is with that and everything.
Yeah, she's definitely a neurodivergent woman. So she has like, I don't know if you'd call them obsessive compulsive disorders or like you know, traits of autism or what, but there's like things need to be a very specific way, a very specific order, and like if not, that's what triggers her like meltdowns, you know.
Yeah, it's just very well done with that. And one other moment I do have to call out that I love is whenever he's sitting there at the typewriter and you see him type, he just types fuck repeatedly.
Yeah, that's the very first thing he types. He's just like fuck.
Yeah, I was just like, that's such a good funny choice there. And I guarantee you Stephen King probably did that. Probably just being like frustrated or just not having...
Me. I mean, I write for a living, not in the same capacity that Stephen King does, obviously, but I write for a living, and whenever I have brain fart and I'm just sitting there looking at the Word document, I'll just like... and then backspace it all, and I'm like,
yeah, doing all that and everything, but it's just done so dadgum well, like him trying to work and solve everything, and whenever it gets to the point, like one of the points that really kind of throws it off in the best way possible is like you see again Annie being super gleeful and then other times being super angry. But then there comes one moment where he's like working on the novel and everything, working on it hard. She comes into the room and she is depressed, like just heavily depressed, and I guess it's like the rain spurs that sort of depression and everything.
Yeah, there must have been, I don't know, maybe the book goes into more detail or something, but yeah, she's like, I just get melancholy when it's like this or something. And then she starts talking about, I've got this gun, you know?
Yeah, because that was just like, oh god.
Yeah, I wonder if that's the day she killed her husband or something. I don't know, or something, but like, yeah, something's obviously, she's deep in her thoughts.
Yeah, and that's the great thing about Annie is she's willing to be super open to Paul because again, like in her eyes, like she loves him and everything. And I think that's one of the other moments as well that popped up during her like depression is like, I knew I loved you as a writer, but now I love you as a person, like as a whole and everything. And she's like, but I know you'll never want me or whatever.
Yeah, she's not dumb. She's a very smart woman, actually. She's just insane. Yeah, she could tell. She's like, I know you're putting on, like, she doesn't say that, but she knows he's putting on an act, like, to some extent. But also she can't help but believe all this, believe this fantasy world that she's, invented for herself. Just like she believes that misery is real and so important or whatever. She believes that this fantasy relationship she's concocted with Paul after stalking him, and making this happen. Yeah. Do you think she did something to cause him to go off the road? Because she was following him. They tell us that much.
I'm not too certain if she did or not. I think
because I don't think they really say that she did or didn't.
I think, in all honesty, I think she was hopeful.
Yeah.
I think maybe she was hopeful because, like, if you look at it, he starts to slide on his own and go off. So
right.
I'm thinking maybe because she knew, like, a storm was coming and she had already been spying on him earlier and everything. Maybe just being like, this is my moment.
Well, I just wonder, because, she knew... And then whenever they talk about it, she says, oh, I knew a storm was coming or whatever. And she also says how much she follows him all the time and that she might get lucky and see him this time or whatever. She's like, I just happened to... But this is where it diverges. Apparently, this time she wasn't following because she said, I just happened to find you. And and then she goes off the road. And they say whenever they initially go off the road and they're tracking it with the helicopter or whatever, that they go out. She goes off the road close to her house.
Yeah.
So, if you know a blizzard's coming, maybe you wet down the road or something. So
that's true.
I don't know, but I don't, because they don't hint how she might have done it. Because you see him just sort of, he's listening to music and he veers off. But what a series of coincidences for somebody who you could tell is already very smart at planning these sorts of things anyway. So
it definitely could and everything else. At the same point, I'm also thinking that maybe it is just sort of fortunate, unfortunate events for each individual because for her, in her mind, she's also smart and acknowledges oh, he never go for a guy like me and writing the books and everything. And then
but at the same time, I mean, how convenient was it that she's a nurse and she could take care of him
for sure. I'm not outruling your logic.
No, and then
it's
she
plausible.
Has all these pills. And she's, I don't know. It's just one of those things that I don't think there's a right answer per se. But I just my headcanon. I think she did it. But
yeah, and I think that's perfectly fine because you saw the memory lane and stuff about her killing a lot of her patients and babies and everything else like that. It's just sort of how she deals with it.
Well, and then the first 3 entries or something you see are people who died in accidental deaths falling off of cliffs or whatever. So I thought that meant she's good at making people go off of cliffs and die. You know what I mean?
That's fair. That's fair. I could totally see that. So
there was one of her classmates in med school or something that was died tragically off a cliff or something, and it was the little newspaper cutouts. That's where he first started being and started flipping or whatever.
Yeah, kind of realizing that she definitely is.
I think the movie
not
hints
a
at
saint.
It. I think the movie hints at it. I don't think it tells you, but I think it hints that she made it happen. That's what I choose to believe.
Okay, yeah, and I think that's perfectly fine. I trust me. I'm not
No.
get a load of this fucking guy. Yeah, I'm not doing that. I definitely believe it. It's just one of those things. I'm like, Yeah, I can see that. I can see that being plausible. In my mind, I just always took it as mere coincidence, but I do think you're right that it happens to be close to the house, that he's following her for what sounds like years already and everything else. So it also could have been just a whole setup and everything. Yeah, and so as it going back to that one depression scene, like I said, it's just so they manage, like, another thing I have to praise about it is that they subvert expectations and give you a whole new emotion where you're uncomfortable, but it's just also just sort of kind of sad in general, but at the same point you can't feel too much sympathy given the fact that she is sort of the antagonist of the story. So
Absolutely. You know what it reminds me a lot of? Baby Reindeer. You ever watch Baby Reindeer?
I know the premise of it, but I haven't seen it.
Okay, the premise of it is basically this woman, but with a stand-up comic instead of an author, and she doesn't trap him, she just stalks him. Go watch it. It's very spooky and scary. But the lady that plays Baby Reindeer, and that one's based off a true story or whatever. But she has a lot of the same man where she will have those moments where she's the same kind of obsessive compulsive stalker type fan that does creepy things to a dude. But then she has those like moments where she just is like in a depression or is in like and she has those mood changes. And the actress that plays that girl is very, very good as well. So really, honestly, very similar characters. Just that one happens to be fictional, one happens to be based off a real person. But
Which is
just check it out.
Yeah. All right. Excellent. Good.
It's a
good
very disturbing.
recommendation.
It's not one of those. I mean, obviously we do a horror podcast now. You can, I know you can handle disturbing, but just so you know, it's just because it's based off a real story, or whatever, and it's acted well, and it's. Dude, that shit is crazy. that show affected me, but
yeah, I think it affected my wife as well because she's like, "Oh my gosh, this show's unbelievable. Cole, you have to watch it." And I'm like, "I'll add it to backlog."
You should.
Yeah.
It's one of those that like after you watch the first few episodes or whatever, like it'll be one of you can't stop. Like,
you'll just you have to binge.
I watched it all in like 2 days because I watched like the first episode and I was like, I have to watch one more, and then so I watched like the first 3 episodes in one night, and then the next day I just like watched the rest of it.
Wow.
Because,
Okay. Well, I might have to move it up in the backlog
anyway,
then. Anyways,
Misery.
yes, back to Misery and everything. Yeah, it's a really just sort of terrifying scene, and again it just leads up, and I think it's just sort of like spiraling to the moment because she's also acknowledging the book's like almost done and everything, and then you'll want to leave and go back or whatever. Because that's the thing, she keeps like sort of gaslighting him about like, oh, the phone lines are down, or oh, the blizzard's terrible out, and then she has to keep coming up with excuses before she was like, oh yeah, I was lying about that stuff.
Right. I love that. Yeah, that's the moment where it really flips, and she's just like, "Yep, you're a prisoner now."
Yeah. One thing I do have to say is like during the B plot or whatever, again, I enjoy watching the sheriff and again just like witty banter between him and his wife or whatever. And whenever he is able to like work with the FBI, because again, it is like a, famous author and everything, they're circling around where they finally find the car that was buried with all the snow with that heavy blizzard, which makes sense.
Right.
And everything, especially because it's like the only thing he had to go off of on that car crash site was a tree. But whenever he went down, he was like, oh, this is way too deep. Like I can't explore any further. But whenever it starts melting and they find the car, and whenever he starts reading the books, I love that there's like a certain line for him that sticks out in his mind. He's like, why does that line stick out? And then whenever he sees Annie Wilkes go into town or whatever,
yeah, she's yelling at some guy saying like cock-a-doodle or whatever.
Yeah, like just basically because that's her form of swearing and everything. He just gets the idea and he's like, okay, I know what's up. And he goes to the library and sees an article where basically Annie Wilkes used the exact same quote from Misery's trial, dealing with her being on trial, which I feel like is very much something a #1 fan would do.
Yeah.
So it doesn't even feel like, oh, what a coincidence. No, it's just believable. And again, he just gets extra confirmation whenever he goes to the general store because again, small town, and it's like, oh, does Annie Wilkes happen to be a big fan of Paul? And it's just like, I literally have to save the first copy for her every single time. Like, she's obsessed. And it's like, has she bought anything on? And it's like, Nothing too much. Been buying a lot of paper though.
And I love how that instantly tells him everything he needs to know, but he doesn't clue in the shopkeep on it or whatever. He's just like. And he goes, oh, nothing weird about that. See ya. Or whatever.
Just walks out.
And he's walking, and the shopkeep's like, ain't he do something? He's like, not a thing.
Just very nonchalant, like nothing.
No, yeah. I love that too. Yeah.
It's so good. And if it makes it all the more heartbreaking whenever she blows a hole through his chest with the shotgun. But again, I do love how the whole scene is set up basically to where, as Paul's in the basement and Annie is like, they're going to catch us. We're going to have to kill each other or whatever. And again, it's just so dang believable that he's like, wait, what about misery?
Right.
We're
so close. We need to, she can live on forever.
That was such a good ass line and everything.
That's the way you get out of that. Yeah.
Yeah. Doing that. And again, of course, he's like, he sees the gas can that she used earlier with the grill that was also down there. And whenever she's like heading up, to like put something away or whatever.
Grab his wheelchair, yeah.
He just takes the gas can and like shoves it down his pants.
Shove it up your butt.
Yeah, shove it up your ass. Doing that and getting in the bed. And of course, he ends up like typing away. And that's one of the small things I do love about Annie is the fact that, she'll get like giddy and excited. And again, he's having to play into her excitement. Like, you'll have to wait.
Right, because if it's not this, then it's suicide pact time. So
yes,
he's writing and he's doing the and he's not bullshitting it. He's writing the book and she loves it.
I do love the one moment though, like after she broke his ankles and he's staring out the window and she's waving hi to him. He just flips her off.
Yeah, and you're such a kidder.
I just love that he just lets his true feelings slip out every now and then towards her.
And I love that it doesn't affect her at all. Because, she knows for sure what this situation is and who... she just knows in her mind, we're meant to be together. It doesn't matter. There's nothing he could do or say or anything that could change that for her.
But it does lead to the ultimate scene of him finishing up the novel. And, of course, he's able to get her out of the room because he's like, I forgot the 3 things. And she's like, oh, what's that? He's like, oh, don't you know? And she's like, oh my gosh, of course, and starts listing each reason as to why he needs a cigarette, a match, and a bottle of champagne. Because it's just sort of, again, the ritual that you see at the beginning of the film taking place towards the end of the film and everything. And again, whenever the opportunity arises, he has it all planned out, and I love that he's using the typewriter as a weight to strengthen his arms.
Yeah, they show him a few times, making sure he can lift the typewriter up, and then that comes to a head.
Yeah, it's just all smart thinking, basically, with all that. And then whenever he sprays the gasoline on there, and he's basically taunting her and being like, oh, you want to know what happens to misery? It's right here. And then he uses the match to light it on fire. And of course, her instinct is, no, I have to find out what happens, because this is the only way I could see it there. And then, of course, he uses the typewriter to club her
over the
on the head. And they end up having this big fight and everything else. And the fight is just definitely believable and brutal. Just the most violent on both sides there, and they're just going for all the shots. Annie's using crotch shots there, and he's going for the eyes and everything, and it's just a constant back and forth to where he's also able to knock her over several times with the wheelchair and everything. And you end up thinking she's dead because she falls and hits her head so dadgum hard on the typewriter on the ground.
$1 babies on the typewriter.
Yes. And of course he's crawling away. It's oh, she's not dead. And they struggle again. And he grabs a little pig statue and whacks her upside the head. It's a dadgum brutal battle, but earlier during ratings, I did mention that I felt the ending kind of rushed. I felt as soon as the sheriff is shot up to that point, it's the film's fuck a little bit. Yeah. And it's not I wouldn't change it. It's not I felt on this film that feels it's drawn out. Draw out that section a little more. but it was definitely like, okay, it felt like they were hustling to the end a little
Yeah.
bit, but not taking shortcuts necessarily. It's just quicker pacing.
I like I got it though, you know.
Yes.
I vibed it because like
Mhm.
she is smart enough to know, and she's done all these crimes, and like she's like she knows that the police are going to come and lock her up, you know, like
Yes.
after shooting a sheriff, you know, she knows it's done for her life as she knows it. And it's why it's like, now it's time. It's the timing. The timing is right, you know. It's not.
Yes.
It's not. I murdered a sheriff, and now I have to, you know,
Yeah,
face
it's-
accountability for that. It's like the time is now.
Yes.
we have to live on forever by killing ourselves or whatever.
Yeah, so I would agree with that. And I do like that you do see sort of like how he's doing like 18 months later. Because
Mhm.
usually a lot of times with horror films, we're just used to sort of like the immediate rescue, film
Right.
ends.
Yeah.
But it's sort of interesting because you sort of see how this has like affected him. Because
yeah.
again, whenever it comes to the book, you know, the publicist who is a bit skeptical of like, are you really going to be successful with something that isn't misery? Is like, oh,
Mhm.
wow, they love it and everything else.
Yeah.
And he's like, yep, it's good. And she's like, you know, that whole situation, yeah, that'd be good piece to publish.
Right.
Don't you want to publish that? And he's like, yeah, sure. You want me to retell the most horrifying moment in my life for
Yeah.
a couple bucks? Sure. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Seems legit.
I liked it on both sides because it was very calloused from her editor, but she did it in like the most like she was like, I would be, you know, reprimanded for being your agent if I didn't ask if you wanted to do a nonfiction piece on this. Or
Yes,
whatever,
like-
you know, and it's like, yeah, it's kind of a piece of shit thing to ask, but
Mhm.
she, you know, did it in the most polite New York editor way possible, I guess.
True. It has some class.
Right.
Yeah.
But then at the same time, he's like, you're asking me to, yeah.
But I do love the ending about him being like, it's so bad, but I still see her face. And you see like the waitress that's Kathy Bates walking down and brandishing that kitchen knife and everything,
Mhm.
walking towards her and just saying, I just still see her face everywhere and
Mhm.
everything. And whenever it gets closer, obviously it's not Kathy Bates, it's like somebody else. And she's like, oh, I'm sorry, are you Paul?
Mhm.
And he's like, yes. He's like, I'm your number one fan.
Yeah.
And it's just like, and all he could do is just sort of like grimace, just like,
Oh, that's very sweet. Yes.
yeah. So it's like it's kind of just sort of poetic that somehow, while Misery is dead, Annie lives on in
Yeah.
his mind and everything.
Right, because she has always been a personification of Stephen King's fans.
Yeah.
So they live on, yeah.
Love you too, Stephen. So yeah, and that ends up being the end of Misery. Anything else you want to add to this film or anything else?
You know, I don't think so. I do appreciate the way that they ended it because, yeah, no, absolutely. I feel like a lot of horror movies don't know how to end. Yeah, but after everyone's died, they're just like, and credits.
Or they have like a jump scare or
yeah,
something
it's
cheap.
just something stupid. Yeah, but I love that they found a way to like sort of tie it all together and cap it off with a neat little bow without it being corny or cheesy or whatever. It's just like, hey, he has to live on with this forever, but like, at least his new book was cool. You know?
Yeah. Yeah,
It's like, okay,
so,
yeah, that resolves everything for me. Yeah.
So yeah, I would agree. Like the very ending, like is like very top notch, and I'm just like, yeah, it's a dadgum good film. I tell you what. So yeah, so that's our thoughts on Misery and everything, and we're gonna go ahead and tease the next episode for the podcast.
Oh boy.
So, what's better than one Stephen King adaptation?
Two Stephen King.
Two Stephen King adaptations.
Woo!
So, well, I hit your hand.
Sorry, I hate
No,
your
no, no.
phone.
I mean, I'd rather your hand be okay.
Well, my hand's fine.
Okay, good. Anyways,
Go home.
so the next film is not only an adaptation, but is a sequel to a Stephen King novel that also was a novel.
Okay.
And we have reviewed this film for the podcast and everything. Title-wise, it'll be a little tricky to name, but think of it as I need synonyms for PhD.
Doctor.
And then rest, nap.
Dr. Sleep.
Yep. Yep. I was like, I'm just doing synonyms here.
Okay,
like,
what's the sequel of?
Yes, it is a sequel to The Shining.
Oh.
So yeah, it was one of those things that I was like up in the air about it. I'm just like, Screw it. Like, Stephen King month, baby.
Let's do it.
Unintentionally. Nostalgia Critic did it. I'm doing it now. Why not?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, brother. So, thank you all so much for listening to this episode. And we'll see y'all again next time when we're popping the scary with Dr. Sleep.
We're gonna return to the king, baby. You know what I'm saying?
Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube, Castbox, or iTunes platforms to stay up to date when new episodes drop. To see what Aaron and I are up to, check out our respective Twitter accounts. For me, it is @ColkirkVA, and for Aaron, it is @AnimalGameDev. Thank you all so much for listening to our podcast. We'll speak to you all again next time when we're popping the scary.